Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Wise Decision Maker Show, where we help you make the wisest and most profitable decisions. My name is Dr. Gleb Tsipursky. I'm the CEO of Disaster Avoidance Experts, the future of work consultancy that sponsors the Wise Decision Maker Show. And today with me is Megan. Megan, can you please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what you do?
Sure. Thank you for having me today. I'm Megan Pierouchakos. My pronouns are she, her, and I am from Seramount. I work at Seramount as a senior director within our talent area of excellence for talent and for diversity, equity, and inclusion, and how those two intersect for organizations.
Okay. And I know you are quite concerned about the return to office strategy and its intersection with diversity, equity, and inclusion. So can you tell me a little bit about how those two areas intersect from your perspective?
Of course, I think it's important to think about people in general and culture in general, and these two things are very important because as we think about the types of cultures we're creating for organizations and for our employees and the types of places they are seeking to work and the types of environments they're seeking to work, they all have very different perspectives. They bring every one of us brings a different preference, perspective, as well as expectation when it comes to the types of companies that we want to work in. So it is extremely important to keep those viewpoints very much in mind and balanced, of course, with business needs.
So let's talk about what that means concretely in terms of diversity, equity, inclusion. Now, we know from extensive research that people who belong to underrepresented groups have a stronger desire to spend more time working remotely. And a lot of research showing this. We can go in depth into this. What does this mean for specifically the impact on the return to office for diversity, equity, and inclusion?
Yeah, I think it's really important, Gleb, to understand that different populations and demographics of employees will have, possibly differing viewpoints when it comes to how they want to work or where they want to work. And even, generational demographics are important to consider here. So for example, when you think about how do you lean into this, is that a lot of organizations, as we know, there's been extensive research on organizations asking their employees about their preferences as it relates to return to office or scenarios and situations. And so what we say at Seramount, and is truly important, is also taking a sort of a double click on the data you collect when you are asking employees about that type of information, and to see if there's any trends or any kind of underlying information that might be worth putting on the mark in terms of ensuring that you're creating an inclusive return to office strategy, and one that does reflect many different demographics, work preferences, as well as in terms of that sort of equity and belonging piece, right? So when we think about how might, for example, employee resource groups be leveraged in that conversation, it's really important to think about how they definitely should be leaned in on when it comes to this. And I can tell you more about that if you'd like in some of the things we've observed during the remote work situation as of late with COVID-19.
Yeah, it's definitely an important issue. So I've helped over 24 companies figure out their transition to the office and figuring out what the return to office strategy looks like. And most of them adopted a hybrid first strategy. A couple of them chose a remote first strategy, but the 23 out of the 25 chose a hybrid first strategy. And relying on ERG groups was a very important component of what it meant. In fact, we had to create some ERG groups for when they didn't exist, for groups that specifically had important issues surrounding return to office. For example, people with disabilities, that is an important demographic. Then parents. So a number of companies that I worked with didn't have ERG groups for parents, didn't have ERG groups for people with disabilities. What have you been finding about employing ERG groups effectively? Because this is a really effective way of getting at the people in these demographics. What have you done at Seramount to connect with the ERG groups and to get people's voices heard? What have you found you needed to do better over time?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, I think it's great you pointed out some of the creation of employee resource groups as of recently, and we saw that as well. We even had some companies we talked to that created remote work employee resource groups that focused on that, right? Also, other employee resource groups that came out of COVID included for example, mental health and also interfaith or religious resource groups as a result of, people feeling needing to have more connection, right, during the time there were shutdowns and offices were closed. One of the things that was a major silver lining, not only with the creation of more employee resource groups, as you mentioned, but also just how more thoughtful, ERGs have always been thoughtful and creative in their programming, but it really did, a silver lining that came out of it was the opportunity to expand inclusive and asynchronous programming beyond home office or hub locations to a more dispersed workforce and also to frontline workers. It also provided more opportunities, right, for people to engage and to rethink accessibility, as you pointed out, right, for organizations that may have spoken with or leaned into their disability employee resource groups to really start thinking about, this would be an opportunity for mandatory recording and closed captioning as part of every event that we do as a result of just a request or, a second thought. And I think also if companies, as we talk about return to office impact, and for those that might be doing more of a, mandated in-person strategy, you might risk losing some of that great, asynchronous and remote accessibility programming that came out of COVID-19. So I do think that ERGs and companies will need to be mindful of that as well.
That definitely makes a lot of sense. And let's talk about some specific groups so we can narrow down. So one Nobel Prize in economics was won by Claudia Golden, who is very well known for addressing greedy work, which greedy work is a term that refers to work that pays a lot of money but demands a lot of time for people, and often people in professional services and finance and law. And she found that greedy work was a major cause for the gender pay gap because women were much less likely to go into these greedy jobs. However, remote work enabled women to take up more of these greedy jobs because women can still work at home and they can still be responsive to the needs of clients, which is the biggest challenge for these greedy jobs, to be responsive quickly to the needs of clients. Now, women going back to the office, being asked to go back to the office means they're less capable of occupying these high-paying but high-demand jobs that they could previously occupy due to being able to work remotely. So that's an example of the kind of thing that you're talking about with losing talent when you're asking people to go to the office. With women, let's talk a little bit more about women. That's something I've been finding about women, and I think that was an insightful finding from Claudia Golden. What have you been finding about the impact of the return to office mandates on women and more broadly remote work?
Yeah, it's a great question because, what we know now is what the statistics are telling us is that we have returned back to pre-pandemic levels of employment for women, right? We knew that during the pandemic, we lost a lot of women in the workforce. Yeah. We are now returned to pre-pandemic. What I think is needs to be mindful there, and this is when we're talking about, and Seramount has done extensive research, especially on women's advancement, right? And so now as you overlay the return to office piece, which you've highlighted also, that there's a real risk and concern that we will see that women will be promoted at a slower rate than men, since many women do, as you pointed out, require more of a flexible work arrangement in order to care for families. And they may not be able to spend as much time or come to the office. And this is as a result, as we know, this term of being sort of, presenteeism, right? So for example, women could be penalized because they are not in the office as much and not see advancement or promotion opportunities as much as we did when everyone was in an office. We have a 100 best companies list that we put out every year where we collect information and data from companies. And, I like to highlight, though, that the 100 best companies are subsidizing everyday childcare. So 39% in 2023 versus 36% in 2022. So we saw a little bit of a climb there, as well as sick childcare. So 72% of our companies that are on the 100 best are offering this versus 68% that were in 2022. And so what I think is important about this is that we need to lean into the fact that, women advancement programs and development and these types of professional opportunities that many organizations offer to help advance women happened just as fine throughout COVID as well, right? And we have to think about ensuring different opportunities for, again, deploying those programs. So remote, hybrid, in person, so that women can still take advantage of these programs and still be considered for very important opportunities within the organization.
Yeah, that's an important conversation. And it's been tricky for my clients because many of them do want to have a culture that is at least partially office-based, but it does cause difficulties for many women. So we've been consulting, when I've been consulting for them, it's been a major topic of conversation. How do you address that pipeline, the pipeline of women leaders, to retain them at least where they are so they don't have to spend less time at work and perhaps not be able to occupy the jobs which they were previously occupied when they were working remotely, and also to advance. So we've been working on things like mentoring programs for women, sponsorship programs for women. I'm curious what you're finding in terms of working on that women leadership pipeline while still having some kind of return to office program.
Yeah, thank you for the question, because this is something that we are very, of course, passionate about at Seramount, and also have done our own extensive research on sponsorship. And we talked to a cultural anthropologist and evolutionary psychologist named Dr. Robin Dunbar from Oxford University, who has done extensive research on how he has really uncovered that it takes 30 hours of connection to move someone from an outer circle as an acquaintance into more of an inner circle, sort of close network. And the reason why this is important to raise is that this is, when you're designing mentoring programs, or even, of course, more so importantly, sponsorship programs, are you providing those opportunities for the 30 hours to be reached during the course of a formal program, right? And if that over the course of a year within a psychologically safe environment for these connections to happen, this really does help change that inner network of senior leaders to then look more intentionally toward women and other represented employees, to pull them into their networks, that they are considering them for those leadership positions and advancement positions in the organization. What's interesting too is that when we were in our survey as well, we pulled out that 93% of companies had a program to identify high potential women who identified as underrepresented, and 28% of the mentees and 32% of those that were sponsored were also women from an underrepresented group. What I also think is interesting is that 78% also did programs that help to prepare women, especially those from underrepresented groups, for key management positions that include things like profit and loss training responsibilities, right? And what I think is the key point here is that these programs flourished within a remote environment. So they can still flourish by now transitioning back into a return to office, in-office strategy. But I would also recommend offering remote components that can also be done, right? And give that opportunity for people to build that 30 hours of connection with one another to move the needle on the leadership within the organization.
Yeah, Robert Dunbar. He's the one for whom Dunbar's number was named for yes, definitely
Right.
Excellent research. Great. So as we wrap up, what is your vision of the future of this intersection of return to office and DEI? How can companies do better besides what we've talked about?
So I think what needs to be really important here is that companies need to continue to listen and pay attention, of course, also as we're welcoming Gen Z into the workforce. They are the most diverse generation in the US's history. and they will make up a third of the workforce by 2030. We have recently done an employee voice session with some chief diversity officers in a collaborative that we have available that's specifically focused on Gen Z. And we found that 75% of them actually prefer a hybrid work environment. So I think there's a lot of assumptions that are happening that Gen Z doesn't want to be in the office, and that's actually just quite false, right?
Yeah.
And I do think that when we talk about what Gen Z wants is they want flexibility. And I do think what's happening, Gleb, a little bit, and maybe you're seeing this too, is that flexibility and 100% remote are getting conflated as that's the only kind of flexibility. Flexibility is still hybrid. Flexibility is still manager and employee, connection and deciding what works best for their office, for their business area and their team. I think that's really important. Companies like Autodesk are figuring that out, quite frankly, when it comes to their return to office strategy. I also think what we need to think about, and this is also from research from EAB, which is that to attract and retain the projected generational workforce of Gen Z, we need to start moving towards benefits that might include things like student loan repayment assistance, well-being support, more beyond sort of just standard EAP services, diversity, equity, and inclusion benefits, and of course, financial advice. What we are seeing also, and I think this is important for our, again, employers who are starting to plan, not just for return to office, but also for the next generation in the workforce, is that 92% of current college students are saying that they are looking for employers that offer mental and emotional health benefits. 71% of them during the job search are looking for employers who share their personal values. And lastly, 66% of them say it's a total deal breaker if an organization culture and values don't align with those of their own. So we're seeing that Generation Z is actually really pursuing what's called a purpose-driven life, where academic and professional experience align to their personal values. So I think organizations just need to be very aware of this and understand that flexibility is one of those values, and that we need to be very, very aware of that.
Yeah, absolutely. I've been definitely finding that Gen Z, large majority of them want to spend some time in the office. They are the generation that are most reluctant to spend full time in the office, but they also are not the generation that wants to be remote the most. That's the millennials. So Gen Z wants to form those social networks, those connections, and they want that flexibility. And again, that purpose-driven approach. Thank you. I really appreciate you sharing your expertise, Megan.
Thank you.
And thank you to the audience for checking out another episode of the Wise Decision Maker Show. Please make sure to subscribe wherever you checked out the show and leave a review. It helps others discover the show and it helps us improve the show.